to Story Corner, the story of World War II. Chapter 1, Storm Before the Fire, 1919-1939. The First World War ended not with a clean sense of victory, but with a lingering bitterness that seeped into every corner of Europe. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in 1919, was intended to secure peace. Instead, it created a fragile world full of resentments, economic instability, wounded national pride, and unresolved political tensions. The fire that would later consume continents was already smoldering beneath the surface. In the aftermath of the Great War, Germany found itself humiliated and economically devastated. The treaty forced the country to accept sole responsibility for the war, pay reparations equivalent to hundreds of billions in modern currency, surrender territories, and limit its military. For ordinary Germans, these terms were not merely political. They shaped daily life. Inflation soared, savings evaporated overnight, and unemployment loomed like a permanent shadow. The Weimar Republic, Germany's fragile democratic government, struggled to find stability amid street violence, political extremism, and economic collapse. Across Central and Eastern Europe, the collapse of empires, the German Empire, Austro-Hungarian Empire, Ottoman Empire, and Russian Empire, created a patchwork of new states. Many of these nations were born into ethnic conflicts, political inexperience, and territorial disputes. Borders seemed drawn by uncertain hands. Minorities found themselves stranded in unfamiliar countries. New governments inherited weak economies and hostile neighbors. Every state, it seemed, carried the seeds of future conflict. Meanwhile, far to the east, a new power had emerged. The Soviet Union, born in the fires of the Russian Revolution and Civil War, the USSR, was ideologically opposed to nearly every other nation in Europe. The Western powers feared the spread of communism, while the Soviets feared another invasion from the West. The continent was becoming sharply polarized. But the heart of Europe's growing instability lay in the rise of new, radical ideologies. Fascism spread like a contagious fever. In Italy, Benito Mussolini had already taken power in 1922, promising national revival, military strength, and a return to Roman glory. His dictatorship inspired imitators, including a failed artist and veteran in Germany, whose name would become synonymous with destruction: Adolf Hitler. The 1920s brought brief relief. The global economy grew, diplomacy steadied, and Germany stabilized somewhat. But this peace was an illusion, shattered in 1929 by the Wall Street crash. The Great Depression struck Europe with even greater force, plunging millions into poverty. Extremist parties, communists, and far-right nationalists gained traction by offering simple explanations and bold promises. In Germany, the Nazis exploited desperation with ruthless efficiency. Hitler claimed he would restore national pride, rebuild the economy, tear up the Treaty of Versailles, and protect Germans from alleged internal enemies through propaganda, intimidation, and political maneuvering. He rose from fringe agitator to national leader. On January 30th, 1933, he was appointed chancellor. Within months, he dismantled democracy entirely. The Nazi regime reshaped Germany with frightening speed. Political parties were banned, dissenters vanished into concentration camps, racial laws stripped Jews of rights, and propaganda saturated every newspaper, classroom, and radio. The concept of Lebensraum, expanding eastward to create living space for Germans, became a driving ideological goal. Germany began a massive rearmament program, openly violating the Treaty of Versailles. The Western powers issued protests, but took no action. Japan, too, was on an imperial path, facing limited natural resources and a growing population. Japanese militarists sought dominance in East Asia. In 1931, Japan invaded Manchuria, creating a puppet state. Western condemnation was half-hearted, and Japan withdrew from the League of Nations without fear of consequence. The invasion revealed a dangerous truth. The global system meant to preserve peace was too weak to enforce its own rules. Italy followed suit. In 1935, Mussolini invaded Ethiopia using chemical weapons and committing atrocities, while the League of Nations failed to stop him. The so-called collective security system was shown to be powerless against determined aggressors. By the mid-1930s, the world was split between democratic nations seeking to preserve peace, authoritarian regimes seeking expansion, and the Soviet Union navigating between self-preservation and ideological ambition. Yet it was in Europe where the coming storm gathered its darkest clouds. Germany under Hitler became increasingly bold. In 1936, he reoccupied the demilitarized Rhineland. France and Britain, exhausted from the Great War and fearful of conflict, did nothing. The lack of resistance became a turning point. Hitler concluded that the Western powers lacked both resolve and unity, an assumption that emboldened his future actions. In Spain, civil war erupted between Republican forces and a nationalist coalition led by Francisco Franco. Germany and Italy sent troops, aircraft, and supplies to support the nationalists, using Spain as a testing ground for new weapons and tactics. The bombing of Guernica by German aircraft shocked the world and demonstrated the destructive potential of modern air power. In 1938, Hitler took his most brazen step yet, the Anschluss, the annexation of Austria. The operation faced almost no opposition. Many Austrians welcomed the Union. Once again, the Western powers failed to intervene. That same year, Hitler demanded the Sudetenland, a region of Czechoslovakia, with a German-speaking population. Britain and France, desperate to preserve peace, met with Hitler in Munich. The Munich Agreement, often remembered as the symbol of appeasement, ceded the Sudetenland to Germany in exchange for Hitler's promise of no further territorial demands. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain famously returned home proclaiming, "Peace for our time." It was a tragic miscalculation. 6 months later, Hitler seized the rest of Czechoslovakia, proving his promises worthless. In the East, Germany and the Soviet Union formed an unlikely pact. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Agreement of August 1939. Publicly, it was a non-aggression treaty. Secretly, it divided Eastern Europe into spheres of influence. With the USSR neutralized, Britain and France suddenly found themselves without a powerful ally. Meanwhile, Hitler turned his gaze to Poland, strategically positioned, militarily vulnerable, and rich in land that Nazi ideology considered essential. Diplomatic negotiations failed, and German propaganda fabricated provocations along the border. On the dawn of September 1st, 1939, German forces stormed into Poland, unleashing blitzkrieg, lightning war. Within hours, Europe realized the truth. The storm that had been gathering for 20 years had finally broken. 2 days later, Britain and France declared war on Germany. World War II had begun. Chapter 2: The Fall of Europe, 1939-1941. The German invasion of Poland on September 1st, 1939, marked the official beginning of World War II, but to those living through it, it felt more like the explosion of a bomb that had been ticking for 2 decades. The assault began at dawn with a violent precision the world had never seen. Waves of Stuka dive bombers shrieked downward from the sky, their engines fitted with sirens designed to terrify populations. Tanks and mechanized infantry punched through Polish defenses before they had time to organize. This was blitzkrieg, lightning war, and it transformed the battlefield. Poland fought fiercely, but it was hopelessly outmatched. Its cavalry charged against tanks. Its air force was destroyed within days. Its army was stretched too thin across too many borders. On September 17th, the Soviet Union invaded eastern Poland under the secret terms of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, sealing Poland's fate. By early October, the country was partitioned between the two totalitarian giants. For Britain and France, war had been declared, but their armies did not move. This strange period, when the Western powers waited behind the fortifications of the Maginot Line, while Germany consolidated its gains, is often called the phony war. Civilians in Paris drank coffee in sidewalk cafes. Londoners read the newspapers, half expecting the crisis to resolve peacefully, yet everyone sensed that a greater storm was coming. Germany struck next in Scandinavia. In April 1940, German forces invaded Denmark and Norway. Denmark surrendered within hours, while Norway resisted with the help of British and French troops. But German naval power and airborne assaults overwhelmed them. With access to Norway's ports and Sweden's iron ore, Hitler strengthened his strategic position for the battles ahead. The real test, however, lay to the west, the invasion of France. For decades, the French military had believed that Germany would attempt to invade through Belgium, just as it had during World War I. They built the Maginot Line, an enormous series of fortifications along the French-German border, but crucially, not along the border with Belgium. The French assumed the line would force Germany to attack through Belgium again, where the French army would meet them. Hitler did attack Belgium, but only as a diversion. The main German force, led by brilliantly aggressive generals such as Heinz Guderian and Erwin Rommel, pushed through the dense Ardennes forest, an area the French believed was impassable for tanks. Within days, German armor flooded through the impossible route, bypassing the Allied defenses entirely. Panic swept through the Allied high command. Communications broke down. Units became isolated. Civilians fled the advancing German columns in massive waves, clogging the roads and making it difficult for armies to maneuver. The speed and coordination of the German attack caught everyone off guard. Entire divisions collapsed under the relentless assault. By late May, British and French forces were trapped against the English Channel. Only a narrow pocket around the port of Dunkirk remained. Dunkirk, the miracle of survival. In a desperate evacuation plan, Operation Dynamo, the British Navy mobilized warships, fishing boats, ferries, cargo vessels, and even private yachts to rescue their trapped soldiers. For 9 days, German aircraft bombed the beaches, while the British and French armies held the perimeter with grim determination. Despite the chaos, the operation succeeded beyond all expectations. Over 338,000 Allied soldiers were evacuated to Britain. It was a retreat, but it saved the core of the British Army and allowed Britain to continue the war. Meanwhile, the Germans pressed onward. Paris fell on June 14th, 1940. The French government collapsed soon after, and an armistice was signed. Northern France came under direct German occupation, while the South was ruled by the collaborationist Vichy regime, led by Marshal Pétain. The fall of France stunned the world. In just 6 weeks, Hitler had achieved what the German Empire had failed to accomplish in 4 years of fighting during World War I. Europe now lay at his feet. Britain stands alone. With France defeated, Britain became the sole major Western power resisting Hitler. Many in the German high command believed Britain would sue for peace, but Britain had a new leader, Winston Churchill, whose defiant speeches rallied the nation. Hitler planned an invasion, Operation Sea Lion, but before attempting it, he needed to destroy the Royal Air Force. The The result was the Battle of Britain, the world's first major air campaign, fought entirely in the skies. Throughout the summer of 1940, German bombers targeted British airfields, radar stations, and factories. The RAF, though outnumbered, used radar technology and home field advantage to intercept the attacks. Young pilots, many barely in their 20s, fought desperately in Spitfires and Hurricanes to defend their homeland. When Hitler shifted to bombing cities in the London Blitz, hoping to break civilian morale, he miscalculated. The British people endured the nightly bombings with astonishing resilience. Underground stations became shelters. Fire brigades raced across the city to extinguish burning buildings. Churchill walked among the ruins, telling citizens that Britain would never surrender. In October 1940, Hitler postponed and ultimately cancelled the invasion. The Luftwaffe had failed to gain air superiority. Britain, isolated, battered, but unbroken, remained a beacon of resistance. Germany turns north and east. After failing to subdue Britain, Hitler expanded the war elsewhere. In April 1941, German forces invaded Yugoslavia and Greece, quickly overrunning both. In North Africa, German troops under General Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, arrived to support Italian forces, pushing the British back in a series of daring maneuvers. But Hitler's true objective lay farther east. Operation Barbarossa, the road to catastrophe. Throughout the 1930s, Hitler had spoken openly about his desire to destroy the Soviet Union and seize its vast resources. In June 1941, he launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest invasion in history. 3 million German soldiers, supported by hundreds of thousands of troops from allied nations, stormed into the USSR across a front stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea. The initial results were devastating for the Soviets. Entire armies were encircled and captured. By late summer, German forces were deep inside Soviet territory, heading toward Leningrad, Ukraine, and Moscow. The world watched in shock as the USSR, butchered by Stalin's purges, and unprepared for invasion, stumbled under the onslaught. Yet the Soviet Union did not collapse. Factories were moved east beyond the Ural Mountains. Millions of civilians joined the war effort. The Red Army regrouped, though at terrible cost, and with winter approaching, the German advance slowed. By December 1941, German troops were at the gates of Moscow, but temperatures plunged to -30 degrees Celsius and below. Tanks froze, weapons jammed, soldiers died from exposure. The Soviets launched a massive counteroffensive, pushing the Germans back and shattering the illusion of a quick victory. Barbarossa had failed to achieve its primary objectives. Hitler now faced a long war on a massive front and a winter he had never planned for. Japan's move and global expansion. While Europe burned, Japan was expanding across Asia. It occupied vast territories in China and eyed the resource-rich colonies of Southeast Asia. But one obstacle stood in its way: the United States, which opposed Japanese aggression and imposed severe economic sanctions. The Japanese military believed that war with the US was inevitable, and that only a crippling first strike could ensure victory. On December 7th, 1941, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. Chapter 3. A World at War, 1941-1943. The attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941, transformed a regional conflict in Europe and Asia into a truly global war. For years, the United States had maintained a tenuous neutrality, providing material support to Britain and China while avoiding direct combat. But when Japanese aircraft unleashed their assault on the U.S. Pacific Fleet, killing over 2,400 Americans and sinking or damaging numerous ships, isolationism died overnight. The globalization of the conflict. On December 8th, President Franklin D. Roosevelt addressed Congress, calling December 7th a date which will live in infamy. That same day, the United States declared war on Japan. Days later, Germany and Italy declared war on the United States, binding the European and Pacific theaters into one colossal struggle. The war now spanned every ocean and every continent except Antarctica. In Asia, Japan surged forward with breathtaking speed. Within months, Japanese armies seized Hong Kong, Malaya, Singapore, the Philippines, Burma, and the Dutch East Indies. British battleships HMS Prince of Wales and HMS Repulse were sunk by Japanese aircraft, demonstrating that air power now dominated naval warfare. Tens of thousands of Allied soldiers were marched into brutal captivity. The fall of Singapore, in particular, stunned the British Empire. Churchill called it the worst disaster in British military history. The American defenses in the Philippines collapsed after a desperate struggle. General Douglas MacArthur, ordered to evacuate, famously promised, "I shall return." His soldiers, left behind, endured the agonizing Bataan Death March, where thousands died from abuse, hunger, and disease. Japan's empire now stretched from Manchuria to the borders of India and deep into the Pacific. But success bred overconfidence. Japanese leaders underestimated American industrial power, the resilience of China, and the determination of the Allies to strike back. The war in the Pacific turns. The United States responded with a rapid, massive mobilization. Factories that once produced civilian goods now churned out tanks, aircraft, ships, and ammunition at unprecedented levels. American shipyards launched aircraft carriers faster than Japan could replace its losses. In the skies, new planes like the B-17, P-38, and later the B-29 changed the face of the air war. In May 1942, the Battle of the Coral Sea marked the first naval battle fought entirely by aircraft. Although tactical outcomes were mixed, the Allies prevented Japan from invading Port Moresby in New Guinea, an important strategic victory. A month later, the Battle of Midway became a turning point. U.S. codebreakers had deciphered Japanese naval communications, allowing American carriers to ambush the Japanese fleet. In a few hours, 4 of Japan's elite aircraft carriers and many of its best pilots were destroyed. Japan would never again regain naval supremacy. The myth of Japanese invincibility was broken. The United States now seized the initiative. The Soviet Union bleeds. While the Pacific War unfolded, the Eastern Front became a titanic struggle that dwarfed all others in scale and brutality. After the Soviet counteroffensive near Moscow in late 1941, Germany regrouped for a renewed assault in 1942. This time, Hitler focused on the south, seeking to capture the oil fields of the Caucasus and deprive the USSR of its vital energy resources. His armies swept through Ukraine, the Don region, and toward the Volga River. The key objective became the industrial city of Stalingrad, a symbolically loaded target bearing the name of Hitler's greatest enemy. The battle that followed was one of the most brutal in human history. The Battle of Stalingrad, from late summer 1942. Stalingrad became a charnel house. German artillery reduced entire districts to rubble. Soviet snipers and soldiers turned every ruined street and building into a fortress. The fighting was so close that soldiers sometimes heard their enemies breathing on the opposite side of broken walls. As autumn turned to winter, the Germans were stretched thin, exhausted, and ill-prepared for the cold. The Soviets launched Operation Uranus, encircling the German Sixth Army. Hitler refused all advice to retreat, believing the city must be taken at any cost. He left over 300,000 Axis soldiers trapped. By February 1943, the Sixth Army surrendered after months of starvation, disease, and relentless Soviet assaults. Stalingrad shattered the myth of German invincibility. It was the beginning of a long, irreversible decline for the Wehrmacht. North Africa and the Desert War, while the Eastern Front consumed millions of lives. Another pivotal campaign was unfolding in North Africa. General Erwin Rommel, the famed Desert Fox, had driven British forces hundreds of miles east toward Egypt, seeking control of the Suez Canal. His daring maneuvers and tactical brilliance earned him respect even among his enemies, but supply shortages and overstretched lines weakened the German-Italian advance. In late 1942, British General Bernard Montgomery launched a massive offensive at El Alamein. After a brutal tank battle, the Axis forces were forced to retreat. Churchill declared, "This is not the end, but it is, perhaps, the beginning of the end." Simultaneously, the United States landed in Morocco and Algeria during Operation Torch, squeezing Axis forces from both east and west. By May 1943, over 250,000 German and Italian soldiers surrendered in Tunisia. The Allies controlled North Africa and prepared to invade southern Europe. The Allied strategic bombing campaign throughout 1942 and 1943, Britain and the United States intensified their bombing campaign against Germany. British bombers attacked by night, American bombers by day. The aim was to destroy German industry, cripple transportation networks, and break civilian morale. Cities like Hamburg, Cologne, Dresden, and Berlin suffered devastating raids. Thousands died in firestorms, and millions were left homeless. Yet the German war machine continued to function, albeit under increasing strain. The bombings remain among the most debated aspects of the Allied campaign, seen by some as necessary to defeat a brutal enemy, and by others as morally troubling. Italy, the weak link of the Axis, with North Africa secured, the Allies turned their attention to Italy. In July 1943, they invaded Sicily. The campaign was fierce, but successful. Italian defenses crumbled, and within weeks Mussolini was overthrown by his own government. Italy surrendered in September 1943, but Germany swiftly occupied the country and rescued Mussolini, establishing him as a puppet leader in northern Italy. The Allies faced a grueling struggle up the Italian peninsula, fighting against well-entrenched German forces in mountainous terrain. Battles like Monte Cassino became symbolically and strategically significant, costing thousands of lives. Still, the fall of Italy marked a symbolic blow to the Axis and opened a new front that weakened Germany further. The Axis overextended. By late 1943, the strategic landscape of the war had shifted dramatically. Germany was bleeding in the east. Italy had defected from the Axis. Japan had lost control of the Pacific. The United States was producing war materiel on a scale unmatched in history. Britain, though strained, remained defiant. The Soviet Union was rebuilding its armies with astonishing speed. The Axis powers remained dangerous, but the momentum was turning. The home fronts, World War II, was not only fought on battlefields, but in factories, farms, homes, and hearts. In the United States, women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers, symbolized by Rosie the Riveter. Millions of men joined the military. Food and fuel were rationed. The entire society was mobilized for war. Yet dark chapters also emerged, notably the internment of 120,000 Japanese Americans. In Britain, civilians endured nightly bombings, strict rationing, and constant fear of invasion. Yet morale remained remarkably high. The evacuation of children to the countryside, women filling industrial roles, and widespread volunteerism demonstrated the unity of the British people. In Germany, Nazism's grip tightened. Propaganda emphasized total loyalty. Resistance was harshly punished. Jews faced escalating persecution, culminating in mass deportations to extermination camps. By 1943, the full machinery of the Holocaust was in operation. In the Soviet Union, civilians faced starvation, occupation, and mass displacement. Entire industries moved eastward. Over 20 million Soviet civilians and soldiers would die before the war ended. An unimaginable scale of suffering. The world was now fully engulfed in flames, but the worst battles were still ahead. Chapter 4, Turning the Tide, 1943-1944. By early 1943, the vast momentum that had once propelled the Axis powers across continents had begun to shift. The defeats at Midway, North Africa, and especially Stalingrad had broken the illusion of invincibility. Now, for the first time since the war began, the Allies held strategic initiative on almost every front, but the battles ahead would be every bit as brutal, costly, and consequential as those that came before. The Eastern Front. The red tide rolls west. After the victory at Stalingrad, the Soviet Union prepared to expel German forces from its territory. Yet Hitler refused to abandon his ambitions in the East despite catastrophic losses. He sought one final decisive offensive. The result was Operation Citadel, aimed at crushing a massive Soviet bulge in the front lines near the city of Kursk. The Battle of Kursk. Kursk became the largest tank battle in history in July 1943. Nearly 3,000 German tanks, including the fearsome Tiger and Panther models, crashed into Soviet defenses. But the Red Army had anticipated the attack. They dug thousands of miles of trenches, laid millions of mines, and built deep defensive zones. German armored columns collided with a wall of resistance. The fighting reached its peak near the village of Prokhorovka, where hundreds of tanks engaged at point-blank range in a chaotic melee. Dust, fire, metal, and smoke fused into a single landscape of destruction. After weeks of brutal combat, the Germans failed to break through. When the Soviets launched their own counteroffensive, the exhausted German forces were pushed back. Kursk was the last major German offensive in the East. From that point onward, the Wehrmacht would fight a desperate defensive war. Over the next year, Soviet armies advanced through Ukraine, Belarus, and the Baltic states. Cities like Kharkov, Kiev, and Minsk were recaptured. The Red Army grew stronger with each victory. The German army weakened irreversibly. Millions of Soviet civilians emerged from occupation, many having endured forced labor, mass executions, and famine. In the East, the tide had turned decisively. The Mediterranean and Italy, the slow road to Rome, following the invasion of Sicily in July 1943, and the subsequent collapse of Mussolini's government. The Allies sought to knock Italy out of the war entirely. Italy's surrender came on September 8th, but Germany swiftly occupied much of the peninsula, turning the campaign into a long and grinding struggle. Operation Avalanche, Salerno. Allied forces landed at Salerno in September 1943. German counterattacks nearly overwhelmed the beachhead, and only intense naval bombardment and fierce infantry resistance saved the Allied position. Once consolidated, the Allied advance northward slowed dramatically as the Germans exploited Italy's mountainous terrain. The Winter Line and Monte Cassino, the Germans created a chain of heavily fortified defensive lines, Gustav, Hitler, and Gothic lines, blocking the Allied advance. At the heart of this system was Monte Cassino, a monastery perched on a high ridge dominating the Liri Valley. Between January and May 1944, the Allies launched 4 separate assaults. Each attack was a hellish ordeal. Rain, mud, snow, minefields, and German artillery made progress nearly impossible. The bombardment that destroyed the monastery itself remains controversial. It killed hundreds of civilians sheltering inside and failed to dislodge the German paratroopers occupying the surrounding ruins. Finally, in May 1944, a coordinated assault by Polish, British, French, American, and other Allied units broke the German defenses. Rome fell on June 4th, 1944. But celebrations were short-lived. 2 days later, the largest amphibious invasion in history commenced in northern France. Strategic bombing and the war in the skies Meanwhile, the Allied strategic bombing campaign intensified. American and British bombers struck aircraft factories, oil refineries, rail lines, and industrial centers deep inside Germany. The Luftwaffe, overstretched and suffering heavy losses on the Eastern Front, struggled to defend the skies. New technologies, long-range P-51, Mustang fighters, advanced radar, and improved bombing techniques gave the Allies increasing dominance. The destruction of Germany's oil production in 1944 crippled the Wehrmacht's ability to move tanks and aircraft. Without fuel, Hitler's armies were gradually suffocated. The bombings took a terrible toll on German civilians. Firestorms in Hamburg in 1943 killed tens of thousands in a single night. Other cities suffered similar devastation. The moral questions surrounding area bombing remain debated, but its strategic effect on Germany's war capacity was significant. The Battle of the Atlantic, lifeline to victory. From the beginning of the war, the German Navy sought to strangle Britain by targeting its shipping lanes. Wolf packs of U-boats hunted Allied convoys, sinking thousands of tons of supplies. For years, the battle hung in the balance. By 1943, however, the tide turned decisively. New technologies, long-range patrol aircraft, improved depth charges, escort carriers, radar, and decrypted German communications gave the Allies a critical advantage. U-boats were hunted down with increasing effectiveness. By late 1943, the Battle of the Atlantic was largely won. Supplies flowed to Britain unimpeded, enabling massive stockpiling for the invasion of Europe. Without victory at sea, D-Day would have been impossible. D-Day, the invasion of Normandy, the turning point of the entire European war, came on June 6, 1944. After years of planning, preparation, and secrecy, the Western Allies launched Operation Overlord, the long-awaited invasion of Nazi-occupied France, the largest amphibious invasion in history. Before dawn, over 150,000 soldiers, thousands of ships, and waves of airborne troops crossed the English Channel. 5 beaches, Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juneau, and Sword, became the gateways to Fortress Europe. At Utah and Gold, progress was relatively swift. At Sword and Juneau, fighting was fierce but successful. At Omaha, American forces faced devastating machine gun fire and artillery from German positions on cliffs overlooking the beach. Bodies washed ashore, landing craft burned. Soldiers used the dead as cover, but by day's end, a fragile beachhead was secured across all 5 sectors. It was the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany. The breakout. The weeks that followed were intense. Thick hedgerows in Normandy created a maze of deadly, close-quarters fighting. The Allies suffered heavy casualties, but gradually broke through German lines. In late July, Operation Cobra unleashed a massive bombardment that shattered German defenses and allowed American forces to sweep rapidly across France. Paris was liberated on August 25th, greeted by ecstatic crowds, waving flags, and embracing Allied soldiers. The Allies now pushed east toward Germany, the Soviet advance, crushing the Eastern Front, while the Western Allies liberated France. The Red Army continued its massive offensives in the east. Operation Bagration, in the summer of 1944, annihilated Germany's Army Group Center, perhaps the most devastating military defeat ever suffered by the Wehrmacht. Soviet forces liberated Minsk, Vilnius, and much of Poland, reaching the outskirts of Warsaw. The city's Polish resistance rose up in the Warsaw Uprising, hoping to liberate the capital before the Soviets arrived. But Stalin halted his armies outside the city, allowing the Germans to crush the uprising brutally. The city was destroyed. Tens of thousands were killed. Still, the overall advance was relentless. Romania and Bulgaria defected from the Axis. Hungary became the last major battleground before Germany itself. The noose around Hitler's empire was tightening. War in the Pacific, island by island. By 1944, the United States had seized the initiative decisively in the Pacific. The strategy of island hopping rather than attack every Japanese-held island. American forces bypassed heavily fortified positions, capturing strategically important islands and cutting others off. This allowed U.S. forces to move steadily toward Japan's home islands. Major victories included Guadalcanal 1942-43, Japan's first major land defeat, Tarawa 1943, a bloody amphibious assault with heavy casualties, Saipan, Tinian, and Guam 1944. These islands allowed the U.S. to launch B-29 bombers directly at Japan. In October 1944, the Allies returned to the Philippines at the Battle of Leyte Gulf, one of the largest naval battles in history. The Japanese Navy, attempting to defend the islands, was decisively defeated. Kamikaze attacks, suicide pilots crashing into Allied ships, became increasingly common as Japanese desperation grew. The Pacific War was becoming a brutal war of attrition, liberation, and betrayal. As the Allies liberated Europe, the truth of the Holocaust emerged. Villages and towns greeted Allied soldiers with joy. But as troops pushed deeper into German territory, they discovered concentration camps, places of starvation, torture, disease, and industrialized murder. At camps like Majdanek, Auschwitz, and Bergen-Belsen, survivors stumbled toward their liberators like ghosts. The scale of the atrocities shocked soldiers, hardened by years of war. Many wept openly. The world would never be the same after witnessing such horrors. The stage is set. By the end of 1944, Germany was collapsing from east and west. Japan was losing its empire island by island. Allied factories were outproducing Axis powers many times over. The global tide had turned irreversibly, but the final acts of the war would be among the bloodiest. Chapter 5. The Fall of Nazi Germany, 1944-1945. Twilight of a Tyranny. By late 1944, the Third Reich was unraveling. The empire that had once stretched from the Atlantic coast to the gates of Moscow was collapsing on all fronts. Yet Hitler, entrenched in his bunker fantasies, refused to concede defeat. He believed that one more miracle, one bolder operation, could turn the tide. But the end was inevitable. The world was closing in, Germany on the brink. In the West, Allied armies advanced rapidly after the liberation of Paris. American, British, Canadian, and other forces swept through France, Belgium, and the Netherlands, pushing inexorably toward Germany's borders. In the east, the Soviet Red Army was conducting massive offensives, crushing German armies and liberating occupied territories. The German population, once promised an empire lasting 1,000 years, now faced hunger, bombing raids, and the terrifying reality of defeat. Cities lay in ruins. Industry crumbled. Railways were shattered. The once mighty Wehrmacht was reduced to scattered, exhausted divisions, with dwindling supplies. Even as Germany faced destruction, Hitler refused all peace overtures. The war would continue to the bitter end. The Battle of the Bulge, Hitler's final gamble. In December 1944, Hitler launched a desperate counteroffensive in the Ardennes forest. The Battle of the Bulge. His goal was to split the Allied armies, recapture Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace with Western powers. For a moment, the gamble seemed to work. On December 16th, German tanks smashed through American lines during harsh winter. Whether that grounded Allied aircraft, American units found themselves surrounded in fog-covered forests. In the town of Bastogne, elements of the 101st Airborne Division held out under siege. When the Germans demanded surrender, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe famously replied, "Nuts." But the offensive soon stalled. Allied air power returned with clearing skies. Supply lines reopened, and reinforcements surged in. By January 1945, the bulge in the lines had been eliminated. Germany had expended its last reserves of manpower and fuel. The defeat marked the death knell for Hitler's hopes. The Allied advance into Germany. In early 1945, Allied armies crossed the Rhine River. The U.S. First Army seized the bridge at Remagen intact, creating a critical bridgehead. Soon, American armored divisions poured into the heart of Germany. British and Canadian forces pushed through northern Germany, capturing key ports and industrial regions. In the south, U.S. and French troops swept through Bavaria and Württemberg. Everywhere they advanced, the Allies faced a landscape of devastation. Burned villages, fleeing civilians, and shattered German formations surrendering by the thousands. As the Allies advanced, they uncovered more concentration camps. The liberation of camps like Buchenwald, Dachau, and Mauthausen revealed scenes of unimaginable horror. Piles of corpses, starving prisoners, medical experiments, and mass graves. Soldiers who had endured years of battle stood speechless at the scale of cruelty. The moral purpose of defeating Nazism became clearer than ever. The Soviet storm, the battle for Berlin. While the Western Allies advanced, the Soviet Union prepared for the final blow against the Nazi regime. In April 1945, over 2.5 million Soviet troops, supported by thousands of tanks and aircraft, launched the Battle of Berlin. The fighting was apocalyptic. Entire districts became rubble as Soviet artillery and air bombardments pounded the German capital. Civilians huddled in basements. Fires raged uncontrolled. The remnants of the Wehrmacht, SS units, Hitler Youth, and Volkssturm, old men and boys drafted in desperation, defended the city with fanatical determination. But little hope. Street by street, the Red Army closed in. Bridges collapsed, buildings burned, and the city descended into chaos. By late April, Soviet troops reached the center of Berlin, surrounding the government quarter. Hitler's last days, the bunker, and the collapse of the Third Reich. Deep beneath the Reich Chancellery, in a concrete bunker, fortified against bombs, Adolf Hitler spent his final days isolated from reality, relying on imaginary divisions and phantom counterattacks. He issued orders to units that no longer existed. Reports of defeat poured in, yet he refused to flee. Hitler's physical health was deteriorating. His hands trembled uncontrollably. He struggled to walk. Those who saw him described a broken, shrunken figure, far from the fiery orator who had once commanded millions. On April 29th, 1945, he married Eva Braun in a brief ceremony inside the bunker. Later that night, he dictated his political testament, blaming Jews, generals, and the German people for his downfall. He insisted Germany had failed him, not the other way around. By April 30th, Soviet troops were only a few hundred meters from the bunker. Realizing the end was unavoidable, Hitler withdrew to his private study at around 3:30 p.m. He shot himself while Braun took poison. Their bodies were carried outside, doused with gasoline, and set on fire exactly as Hitler had instructed. With his death, the dictatorship that had plunged the world into war finally collapsed. The surrender of Germany. After Hitler's suicide, German resistance disintegrated. His chosen successor, Admiral Karl Dönitz, attempted to negotiate a partial surrender to the Western Allies, hoping to allow German troops and civilians to flee the Red Army. But the Allies demanded unconditional surrender. On May 7th, 1945, Germany signed the surrender documents at Reims, France. The following day, the surrender became effective. Europe erupted in celebration. May 8th, 1945, became known as V-Day, Victory, in Europe. Crowds filled the streets in London, Paris, New York, Moscow, and countless liberated cities. Tears flowed freely. Strangers embraced. Church bells rang. After nearly 6 years of war in Europe, the nightmare was finally over. But the global conflict was not. The war continues in the Pacific. Even as Europe celebrated, Japan fought on. Though badly weakened, Japanese forces resisted fiercely. The battles of Iwo Jima and Okinawa in early 1945 demonstrated the extreme lengths Japan would go to avoid surrender. Kamikaze attacks intensified. Civilians were encouraged to die rather than be captured. The United States prepared for a massive invasion of Japan's home islands, a plan projected to cost hundreds of thousands of Allied lives and potentially millions of Japanese casualties. In August 1945, the war reached its horrifying climax. The atomic bombs. On August 6th, 1945, a U.S. B-29 bomber dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima. The explosion obliterated the city in seconds. 3 days later, a second bomb destroyed Nagasaki. The unprecedented power of the bombs shocked the Japanese government, combined with the Soviet invasion of Manchuria and the collapse of Japan's defensive perimeter. Tokyo finally accepted defeat. On September 2nd, 1945, aboard the USS Missouri, Japan formally surrendered. World War II had ended. The aftermath, a world transformed. The war left the world changed forever. Human cost, over 60 million people died, soldiers, civilians, prisoners, children. The Holocaust murdered 6 million Jews and millions of others. Cities across Europe and Asia lay in ruins. Entire nations were uprooted, populations displaced. The human suffering defies measurement. Political transformation. With the war's end, the United States and the Soviet Union emerged as superpowers. Europe lay devastated and was divided east and west. Colonial empires began to collapse. The United Nations was created to prevent future global war. Yet peace was fragile. Within a few years, the Cold War began, shaping global politics for decades. Judgment and memory. The Nuremberg trials held Nazi leaders accountable for crimes against humanity. The world, confronted with the depths of human cruelty, vowed never to forget the consequences of tyranny, racism, and unchecked power. Memory became a weapon against repetition. Conclusion. The end of a global cataclysm. World War II began with dreams of empire and ended with cities in ashes. It was a conflict shaped by ideology, ambition, courage, and unimaginable brutality. It united nations, destroyed nations, and created a world order that still defines modern life. Its legacy is etched into every corner of human history. In the memorials of fallen soldiers, in the testimonies of survivors, in the graves of millions, and in the determination of nations to avoid another global war. This final chapter closes the narrative of a conflict that reshaped the world and reminds us why its lessons must never be forgotten.